but Hannah will now speak for 45 minutes and give an overview of the situation in Britain. Hannah.
Well, comrades, we've heard in the last session about revolts, revolutions, uprisings that have shaken different countries around the world, and also the fantastic opportunities that the CWI now has, particularly in the US and South Africa. We're discussing in the rest of the Congress, including in this session, how we prepare for similar events and opportunities in Britain. Now, clearly, we're not there yet, but nonetheless, if you look at economic crisis, inequality, austerity, polarisation of wealth and anger, everything that was described in the last session applies equally to Britain. I'm not going to give loads of statistics. Comrades know the reality. But real incomes have fallen by an average of 7% in Britain between 2009 and 2012 on average. That is the biggest three-year drop on record. And in Europe, it is only Greece, Portugal, devastated economies, and also the Netherlands that have suffered an equal fall in living standards. And of course, that's the average. There are all kinds of horrific examples of the poorest and most vulnerable in society, of the young man, for example, who had his benefits cut and literally starved to death, that was in the press last week as a result of the austerity that has taken place in Britain. And that drop in incomes doesn't include, in general, the drop in the social wage, the savage cuts that have taken place particularly in local authority spending, which will have fallen by an average of a third by next year, 2015. So devastated are local services that, as comrades probably saw in the press yesterday, even the Council of Europe has declared that Britain is no longer providing the legal minimum because the services have been cut beyond what is necessary to provide the very basics. And at the same time, the polarisation of wealth that has taken place globally is, if anything, more extreme in Britain than many other countries. Again, there's been stuff in the press in the last couple of days about how there are just over 150,000 people who are worth more than $21 million each. Collectively, they have $21 trillion worth of assets. That's more than the annual output of the US and Germany put together. But the point is, more of those super rich individuals live in Britain than in any other country on the planet. I mean, obviously, most of them have several homes in different countries, but they have more in Britain than in any other country because we have become such a haven for the world's super rich. So, as a result of the enormous inequality and the driving down of living standards, there is a visceral, but as yet inchoate, class anger that has developed in British society. It's under the surface at the moment, as Robin just said. And as I will go on to explain, and as all the comrades are aware, it has not had a reflection in a mass movement against austerity in the course of the last year, as a result of the role of the leadership of the trade union movement. But nonetheless, whenever a lead is given, the working class responds enthusiastically. The tube strike in London, I think people felt this nationally, but certainly you felt it if you were in London during the strike, was a really clear example. The strike itself, the outcome of it is not yet certain. There are negotiations taking place, and our comrades, including those taking part in the talks, are arguing we have to be prepared to take further strike action if major concessions are not given in those negotiations. And by the way, all of this is just round one. It's just 6% of the cuts that they want to carry out to London transport. But while the reality might be slightly more complicated, the perception of working class people is that Boris Johnson and Transport for London said we will not negotiate with the RMT unless they call the strikes off, and then they were forced to do a U-turn and come crawling back and suspend the proposed cuts while negotiations took place. And that is also, by the way, the perception of big sections of the capitalist class. Not many of us read the Times or the Telegraph, but if you do, it was full, both of them, with fury, obviously at Bob Crowhan, the RMT, but also at Boris Johnson, because he had talked tough, talked about the Tories having their miners' moment, and then, in the view of the Times and the Telegraph, turned tail and fled and revealed the real weakness of the capitalist class. But what was most significant for us is that it was palpable during the strike that despite the enormous inconvenience of the tube network grinding to a halt, people supported the strike. And in fact, their heads went up. Finally, somebody's doing something against these gits, and good. And that was the mood in London. 65% of people in opinion polls supported the strike taking place. There was a feeling somebody's got a bit of power and they're using it against those that are in power. And it gives you a little glimpse of how the mood of the working class and in society in general would be transformed if we had seen a 24-hour general strike against austerity. Just one section of workers fighting back and showing they got a bit of power immediately lifted people's shoulders to feel maybe we can do something to fight back after all. But of course, again, as I'll go on to explain, then we haven't seen widespread, coordinated strike action. And so the mood is more, it could be described really, the mood in British society at the moment as one of sullen anger. People are fed up and they're almost kind of sulking about it because they can't see an effective means to fight back. The Hansard Society do an annual survey of attitudes to politics. And the one at the end of 2013 was the 10th one that they've done. And they produced a summary of it in which they said last year's audit, they're talking about 2012, showed a public that was disgruntled, disillusioned and disengaged. This year's is worse. And it's true, if you look at the statistics. The most commonly used word by people when they're asked to describe how they feel about politicians was angry. 47% of people said that they were angry. That's not just anger against this government or specific parties, it's anger against the capitalist politicians as a whole. So the Hansard survey showed that only 27% of people believe that Parliament, the institution, is doing a good job. It also showed that just 41% of people say they are certain to vote in the next general election. And amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, it was only 12% who said that they were certain to vote in the next election. Now that mood gets described as apathy, but it's not apathy. It's anger. It's almost a form of a voters' strike that is taking place. And it's not an easy task. But as we'll go on to discuss in the next session, convincing some of those angered and alienated workers and young people to vote for Tusk as an important part of what we have to do in the next elections. Now, of course, many protest by not voting. Some are protesting by voting for UKIP. And that is not because workers see UKIP as a party with excellent policies, or because they agree with the introduction of flat rate taxation. It's because UKIP seems like the only available weapon with which to hit back at the major parties. But it would be wrong for us to think that UKIP now is only getting a vote from a section of disillusioned Tories, because actually that clearly isn't the case when you look at the statistics. Of the 10 places in Britain that are most UKIP friendly, 8 of them are Labour constituencies. In other words, it's a section of workers who are considering protesting at this stage by voting UKIP. Now, the Hansard report gives a list of reasons why people feel as they do. They start with the continued unpopularity of the bankers. They go on to the major corporations' tax avoidance. They add economic crisis and lowering living standards, the perception that the government only helps the rich, a crisis of public institutions, and for that they particularly mention the media and the police. I mean, you couldn't give better summary in a few sentences of the reasons that people are feeling angry with the politicians. The one straw that the Hansard Society clutch at is, well, maybe the economy is going to get better. And so in the next survey, at the end of 2014, people might be a little bit more interested in politics again. However, we've got to say, it's a very slim straw. It's not looking like the economy is going to get better. Not that it's as simple as that. As comrades commented in the last session, if we were to see some real growth in the British economy, actually it would probably be favourable for us, as it has been with the very limited growth in the US, because it would give workers more confidence to say we want to take back a little bit of what has been taken from us in the course of the last 5 years. But you've got to say that doesn't seem to be on the cards in Britain. It's true that the Bank of England is predicting 3.4% growth in 2014. But that's very optimistic, and even if it happens, it will only make the British economy marginally bigger than it was in 2008. Right now, it is still almost 2% smaller than it was in 2008, while manufacturing is a massive 8% smaller. But the limits to growth were shown yesterday by a report of the OBR, the government's own Quango, who said that they thought that while there was growth at the moment, it was unlikely to be sustained on any healthy basis, it would be very limited, and that therefore, if the government wants to eliminate the deficit, Osborne in his budget in a couple of weeks' time should add another £20 billion worth of cuts to those that have already been announced in order, supposedly, to try and balance the budget. And that's the central point for us. Whatever limited, and it's very limited, recovery is taking place, it does not mean an end to austerity. On the contrary, it is continuing to rain down on the working class. It's true that unemployment has fallen a little bit, although there's huge regional variation in that. If you look at the position in the north, in Wales, there's not really been a fall in unemployment. But even as far as unemployment has fallen, underemployment hasn't. There are still 8 million workers in Britain who cannot get as many hours as they need in order to make ends meet. And of course, wages have been driven down throughout the recession. But as we've made the point, and this was also touched on in the last session, it accelerated during the economic crisis since 2008. But the trend that the share taken in wages has gone down began long before that. If the share taken in wages had remained static since the 1970s, then British workers collectively would take home an extra £60 billion a year. That's £1,000 for every man, woman and child in Britain. And again, this issue was touched on in the last session, but it's acute in Britain that there are a section of the capitalist class, and it's reflected in the Tory party and the CBI, who can see the case to increase wages. And that is partly because they fear a revolt over the question of low pay. They fear, as Dave Reed put it, bricks and worse coming through their windows if pay doesn't increase. But it is also a recognition that an increase in wages would enable them to sell more of their goods and therefore to realise greater profits. That, if you like, the realisation of their profits via selling the market does matter. Now, it's all right them saying that. It doesn't mean, as we point out in the perspectives document, that it's going to happen, nor, of course, that it would solve the fundamental crisis of capitalism were it to do so. But it's one thing for the capitalists to recognise in the abstract that it would be good if wages were to go up. It's altogether another for individual capitalists to cut across their own profits by increasing their workers' wages. And so the same CBI meeting that discussed the importance of raising wages, only 7% of the employers asked at that meeting said they actually intended to raise wages above the level of inflation. And of course, all the talk on the minimum wage, what did it come to? I think it's a paltry 19p by which they're proposing to introduce, to increase the minimum wage. The reality is that for decades, British capitalism, once the most powerful capitalist power on the planet, has been based on a low-wage economy and concentrating on finances and the service sector. And it's too late. They can't go back from that, from where they are now. It's not possible to change it. If you look at the figures for Germany, just 20% of the workforce are classified as low-paid. In France, it's 30%. In Britain, not low-paid, sorry, low-skilled. In Britain, the figure is 60%. Manufacturing today accounts for only 12% of output compared to 25% in 1980. Now, it's a global trend, the hollowing out of the advanced capitalist countries' manufacturing base. But Britain takes it to extremes. It's only France, the US and Greece that has a bigger service sector as a proportion of its economy than Britain does. And Britain's not Greece. It's not that weak a world power. It still has a substantial economy, but nonetheless, we are continuing a slow, inglorious decline to be a third-rate capitalist power. All the talk from the government, which they did have a couple of years ago, about the march of the makers, rebalancing the economy, a return, in other words, to manufacturing, has come to absolutely nothing. And that was despite sterling being devalued by a quarter between 2007 and 2012. That gave a big opportunity to British manufacturing, which it was too weak to take advantage of. Now there's a certain recovery of sterling, and as a result, even the few success stories, Rolls-Royce, for example, are now issuing a profit warning as a result largely of the rise in sterling. And the other point we'd make on British manufacturing is it is a kind of unwinding of history. Because if you listen to the government, you'd think you'd be talking about major manufacturing firms, but in fact, manufacturing in Britain in the main exists on a very small scale. Over the last 25 years, there's been a doubling of the number of manufacturing units that employ, manufacturing companies that employ 10 or fewer workers. That is now 75%, 3/4 of all factories in Britain that employ 10 or fewer workers. A return, if you like, to the prehistory of British capitalism. And if you think, as the government suggests, well, that's true, but they're all making very, very fancy, modern technology type things, that's not true either. Modern technology in the British economy is not that strong. Of course it exists, there's a big pharmaceutical sector, but actually the strongest section of British manufacturing makes food and drink, the very opposite of high-tech manufacturing. So it's not about to change. The levels of investment in manufacturing in Britain remain at a historic low. The lack of profitable fields of investment, as we've said many times, is one of the reasons the capitalist class are so keen to privatise huge swathes of the public sector. But what are the prospects for growth in the British economy? Where is the growth coming from? Well, most of you will have heard the quote from Mark Carney, the new governor of the Bank of England. But it does sum the situation up, where he says by 2050, then the UK's banking assets will exceed 9 times gross domestic product, and in his view, that is an exciting prospect. Exciting is one word, horrifying would be another. That literally turns Britain into a giant version of Iceland before the crash, and we all know how that ended. Big sections of the capitalist class know that. But because the road to profits in Britain is based on the finance sector and the development of that, then despite knowing how it might end, they push that to the back of the minds and continue down the same road. The City of London reigns supreme. We're going to get by on being the world trading centre for the Chinese currency. And by the way, it's not just a question of the city. It's also the service sector in Britain, where if you look, for example, at advertising and other aspects of the service sector, a big part of that is acting for companies that make their goods in China, in many cases for Chinese companies. There's a limit, by the way, to how long China will necessarily want to outsource those kinds of aspects of things to the UK economy. So it's the city on the one hand, and then it is also a certain limited growth in consumer spending that has taken place. But clearly, as we all know, that has not come from an increase in wages. On the contrary, it's come partly from PPI payments, one-off payments, but also from a certain loosening of credit conditions. But the ratio of household debt to income, while it fell in the course of the last 5 years from 163%, which is what it was in 2008, to 137% today, that is still the level it was in 2004, which at that time was a world record in the course of history. And even with interest rates at the incredibly low levels they are at the moment, there is a real limit to how far workers will be prepared to borrow in order to spend more money. So there's very little reality in the growth that is taking place formally in the British economy at the moment. And far from blunting the anger of the working class, as Hansard hoped, it will continue to increase it. By the way, even if limited formal growth continues beyond the next general election, and that is not guaranteed, it will be storing up enormous problems for the next government, particularly if it's a Labour government. If you think how the Tories have beaten Labour for being responsible for the meltdown in the city, and then they come to power on the basis of a certain economic growth on a new mini-bubble, and then that bursts, what consequences that would have for Labour. Our prediction that Labour will be in power as unpopular as Hollande could turn out to be a severe underestimate of how Labour would be seen in that situation. Now, for a whole period, we have seen what we've described as an Americanisation of British politics. And that's what I talked about a while ago, less and less people voting, in the main the working class, because they cannot see a difference between the main parties. The working class is effectively disenfranchised. Actually, even the bizarre fact that the Tories have started talking about being a party of the working class is a weird, distorted reflection of that disenfranchisement of the working class. In the future, maybe we're going to be using the Americanisation of British politics in a different sense to mean the growth of socialist ideas and mass electoral support for socialist ideas. Now, Seattle is not posed immediately in Britain, but nonetheless, on the horizon, we can see developments towards a mass workers' party of more significance than anything we've seen in the many years for which we've been putting forward this idea. The special Labour Party conference took place last Saturday. The whole conference took 2 hours. That's barely more time than my speech is going to take. That's a joke, by the way. Not a good one, I accept. But in that time, the last remnant of the collective voice of the trade unions within the Labour Party was destroyed with the overwhelming support of the leaders of the affiliated trade unions. We had a Tusk protest outside the special Labour Party conference. Incidentally, it had far more impact than the Labour lefts who were also standing outside leafleting the Labour Party conference. But what was striking was the attitude of the trade unionists who were going in, who clearly are not the broad mass of trade unionists. Rob Williams was shouting through the megaphone, "You're like turkeys voting for Christmas." And I was thinking, is that a bit sharp, you know? But actually, when you spoke to them, they were like, yeah. Because they did feel, they couldn't justify it, they did feel like they were turkeys going in to vote for Christmas. And most of them were not going to get to vote. Certainly the Unite delegation were not allowed to carry out the vote themselves for fear that they might break the rules and vote against the Collins review and break the discipline of Unite. Now, As predicted in the Perspectives document, the Labour leadership have succeeded in finding a fudge which the trade union leaders have been able to swallow. They hope, the Labour leadership, that they've satisfied the baying of the capitalists and the Tories to break the link with the unions, although, of course, as Kevin Maguire rightly pointed out in the Mirror, until they start deporting trade unionists to Australia, the Tories and the capitalists will never be happy, no matter what Labour does to attack trade unionists. But they managed to get the trade union leaders on board by the fig leaf of keeping the block vote at the Labour Party conference for the next 5 years. Miliband can only do that because the Labour Party conference is already completely toothless. Look at how it voted for renationalisation of Royal Mail, and the shadow cabinet dismissed that literally half an hour later. But even that will not remain the case. The block vote at the Labour Party conference will go as well. The idea is that over the next 5 years, each trade union signs up these new affiliated supporters, and within the 5 years they can adjust how much of the block vote the different unions get on the basis of how many sign up. But of course, as everybody knows, at the end of the 5 years they'll say, what, you've only got 100,000, 200,000 trade unionists signed up, you can't keep this vote, and will then move to abolish those few tiny remnants. And even 100,000 or a few 100,000 is likely to be an exaggeration with the way that things are going. It's very interesting. Jenny Formby, the political officer of Unite, published an article saying how great it was the Collins Review had been passed, what a fantastic new opportunity. Every single comment from Unite activists underneath when I read it was saying, are you mad? This isn't good. We've got no rights left. Remember Falkirk. But particularly interesting was a recruitment officer who said, you think we can sign up 10% of Unite members to the Labour Party on this basis? I think we'll be lucky to get 1%. The GMB sent out, let me get the figure, 20,000 free Labour Party membership forms to their members. They got 12 responses. That was before the Collins Review went through. Even Socialist Appeal, who are still clinging to the Labour Party, have been forced to warn their members, don't expect many trade unionists to tick the affiliated members box form, presumably because they haven't yet realised the historic role of the Labour Party. Now, we've quite sharply criticised the union leaders, with the honourable exception of the Bakers Union, who went and voted for the Collins Review. The arguments that we have raised have struck home. Ask Rob Williams about the phone call he got from Len McCluskey about our centre pages aimed at the Unite executive, expressing, shall we say, quite strong disagreement with the points that were made in there. We offered him an opportunity to debate it in the pages of the Socialists. But the reason it struck home is because of the enormous anger of trade union members over what has taken place on Collins. Let's be clear. Fighting to transform the Labour Party was never our strategy. We've always argued that the link should be broken and that Len McCluskey and others should work towards the unions founding a new party. But when the leadership of Unite said we're going to fight to change Labour, we said, OK, if you're going to do it properly. Test it in action, and if it doesn't work, as we suspect will be the case, then draw the necessary conclusions. And it's been correct that we've taken that transitional approach. It's helped, actually. And by the way, if they'd gone down that road, even if they'd lost, it would have helped to prepare the mass of Unite members for launching a new Workers' Party. But of course, instead of that, Unite has been kicked. Falkirk was the jewel in their crown, and look how that's ended. And they've now folded and voted for the Collins Review, and worst of all, attempted to dress it up as something positive. That will not wash with Unite members or with other trade unionists. After all, they passed the Collins Review, and the next day, Dr. Death, David Owen, the man who led the right-wing split from Labour, the SDP, in the 1980s, welcomes it, gives money to Labour, and so on. Tony Blair has promised a substantial donation to reward Labour for doing the right thing and to make up for some of the money, and he's got enough, that they lose from the trade unions. So the idea that this represents a new opportunity to transform the Labour Party, frankly, that is laughable to most trade unionists in the affiliated trade unions. doesn't mean that they can't get away with continuing to give big donations to Labour on top of the fees between now and the general election, with the idea not of workers being enthusiastic about that, but we've got to do it because it's the only means by which we can defeat the Tories. But even that will not be easy for them. It is not insignificant that Len McCluskey has taken sole charge of giving extra donations to the Labour Party from Unite on the spurious, in our view, grounds that they might have to decide in a hurry so they wouldn't have time to call the executive together and so on. The reality is they're frightened that the executive would block the donations that they are going to want to give. Now, we'll have more discussion on this in the next session, but we have to conduct a campaign, yes, for a mass workers' party, but we also have to say in the unions, not one extra penny to go on top of the affiliation fees to the Labour leadership, to the Labour Party. And in addition to that, Labour has broken the link with us. We have to change our rule book to open the road to backing candidates who are trade unionists, who stand on the programme of our trade union, and in particular, of course, we will argue the case for backing Tusk candidates. Now, the very fact that Len McCluskey and others in the leadership of Unite are talking quite widely about, well, we're doing this now, but beyond the general election, we might have to start a new party. It doesn't excuse what they're doing now, but it is an indication of the pressure that they are under on this issue. And of course, that is not just related to what's taking place inside the Labour Party, but also the savage attacks that Labour councils are carrying out up and down the country against local authority workers and public services. That's not just on the question of cuts in services, but increasingly also cuts on trade unionist rights. In Waltham Forest, and I know it's the case in other councils, there are big cuts taking place in facility time. So the unions, including, by the way, trade union members who are councillors, are voting to cut trade union rights, and we have to have a ferocious campaign against that taking place. Waltham Forest are doing it, and yet only 2 Tory councils have done it yet in London. The big majority of Tory councils have not yet dared to carry that attack out. So we've got huge cuts taking place at local level, and no matter how bad they are, the vast majority of Labour councillors are continuing to vote for those cuts. There's only a tiny handful of councillors, and we're very pleased to have, I think, 2 of them here in the hall today from Southampton, who have dared to vote against the cuts in Labour-controlled areas. And it's not a coincidence that it's people that we have worked with in the main who have dared to do that. And it terrifies the right-wing trade union leaders and also the Labour leaders. There was a meeting took place between the Unison officials and representatives of the councillors against the cuts campaign. And what was striking in the report that we had afterwards is all that the Unison leadership wanted to talk about was Southampton. You can't go down the Southampton road, it doesn't work, you can't move a no-cuts budget. They were terrified, not of Liverpool City Council, not of the whole council defying the government, but 2 councillors daring to vote against cuts at local level. And that gives an indication of how rare it is, but also how terrified they are of that idea gaining momentum. The work that we are doing in Tusk at the moment, even though we don't expect a big electoral breakthrough in the next elections, is vital in preparing the ground and showing that it's a serious alternative which trade unionists who are fed up with what's taking place in Labour can look towards and draw conclusions, perhaps at a later stage. And I must just say, before moving on from this as an aside, it's our attitude of taking a federal approach in Tusk, of putting the role of the organised working class central, has been proved absolutely correct as by recent events. What a time for left unity to argue that the only way to be democratic is 1 member, 1 vote, when 1 member, 1 vote is being used as a method to bring Dr. Death back into the Labour Party. We've been completely vindicated on this issue. Now, beyond the general election, the question of a new party is going to be posed really regardless of the outcome. Whether you get a Labour government that comes to power and carries out austerity, but also if Labour were to manage to fail to win the election, the idea that the trade union leaders could say, keep funding Labour and maybe in 5 years when there's no public services left at all, we'll be able to get rid of the Tories, that equally would not wash. Of course, if a new party is formed by figures from the trade union movement, it is not automatic that we would be welcomed with open arms. The People's Assembly at the moment looks towards Labour. But you can envisage a situation where it could become the kernel of a new formation which would be desperate to keep us out because of the threat that we would pose. In our view, the position we've got in the trade union movement, the work that we've done with the RMT and others in Tusk, but also the growing support for socialist ideas amongst important sections of the working class, all of those things will make it impossible to marginalise us from a new formation, but it doesn't mean there can't be attempts to do that. Now, to go on to the likely outcome of the general election, the perspectives document really says, well, this could happen, or that could happen, and that is a reflection of the reality at the moment, because given the hatred of the Tories and the Liberals, we would expect, you would think, a majority Labour government. And that can happen. They can win a majority Labour government because how hated the current lot are. But on the other hand, where they're putting forward just another version of Tory policies, it's possible that they can throw that opportunity away. And so you can't absolutely exclude even another Tory Liberal coalition. The Liberals in any coalition are likely to be a lot littler next time round, but a Tory Liberal coalition on the basis of mass abstentionism, a feeling of a plague on all of your houses, perhaps a few illusions that the economy is upturning amongst sections of the working class. It's not the most likely, but we cannot say that it will not happen. A Labour Liberal coalition probably seems more likely at this point in time. Now, in the past, because of the history in the Labour movement, the coalition governments that took place in the pre-war period, there was a deeply ingrained idea amongst big sections of organised workers that Lib-Lab coalitions, coalition governments were wrong, a bad thing, a betrayal, and so on. The changed character of the Labour Party today, apart from other reasons, means it's not perceived in the same way. And a coalition government, if it was a means to stop the Tories coming in, could initially be seen by workers as a step forward beyond the general election. But that's not going to last. Whether you get a Labour majority government or a Labour Liberal coalition, the policies they will carry out, which doesn't mean there can't be a few little concessions, but the continuation of austerity, the policies they will carry out, the economic situation means that they will very quickly become unpopular. No doubt, Miliband would like to give himself a certain financial cushion from that unpopularity by moving to state funding of political parties. But it's not certain, he doesn't comment on this in the perspectives document, but personally, in my view, it's not certain that they would be able to carry that out. There's a few things. One is, it's enormously unpopular. People don't like the idea of taxpayers' money going to fund political parties, given the view of political parties. But the other is that that would take the pressure off the trade union leaders to fund Labour, and therefore actually could speed up the process of the development of a new mass workers' party. How long have I had, Robin? Okay. But there's no doubt, whatever the stripe of the next government is, it will be a government of crisis. Above all, that is going to be because of the mighty class battles that will take place. And I'll go on to comment on that. But I just want to very briefly mention other points of crisis that are likely to develop under the next government. One is the issue of Europe. Labour are under enormous pressure from other capitalist parties around Europe to promise not to call a referendum. But they're also under enormous electoral pressure in Britain to call a referendum. 75% of people would support a referendum on Europe. And even while this is a very difficult issue for the Tories, which actually could split them down the middle if they were to win the election, that wouldn't stop them hounding Labour if they don't call a referendum beyond the election. So that can be an issue of crisis before the next election. There are more points on that I don't have time to go into. There's also the question of how UKIP will develop. It's still an ephemeral protest party at this point in time. And it can fade away and be replaced by other things. But on the other hand, for the capitalist class, it's a relatively safe outlet for people's anger, compared to the far right in terms of the BNP or the EDL, and above all, compared to us and the left. They would far rather that people were going and voting for UKIP. So it can continue to develop for a period of time. It will certainly get a good vote in the European elections that are coming up. And beyond the election, you can't exclude a section of the Tories splitting away and becoming UKIP MPs if they do relatively well in the general election. There's also the thorny question of immigration. I don't have time to go into this here. We've dealt with it in more detail in the last two perspectives discussions, but it continues to be an issue which we have to have a very careful approach to. We have to, of course, trenchantly defend the rights of migrants, asylum seekers, and so on, but at the same time recognise that when the working class feel resentment towards widespread immigration, that's partly because it's whipped up by the right-wing media and the capitalist politicians, but it also reflects the way the capitalist class have used migrant workers as super-exploited workers in an attempt to drive down wages. And we, of course, have to respond by saying the only solution is to unite together for everybody to get the rate for the job and so on, to patiently explain. But it's also a big problem for the capitalist parties. We've said many times they've got a schizophrenic attitude on this issue. On the one hand, they want to win votes by appearing tough on immigration, but they also want to do the bidding of big business by providing cheap labour for their needs. And it's not simple for them. Look at the situation for this government. They have attempted to be tough on immigration. Brutal policies towards workers coming from outside Europe. Terrible anti-Bulgarian and anti-Romanian propaganda. And yet, despite that, the number of people coming into Britain increased in the first 9 months of 2013, a net increase of 212,000. Why was that? They didn't mainly come from Eastern Europe. They came from Greece, from Portugal, from Spain. And that's the other answer that we've got to honestly give to workers. When you've got a situation where a quarter of young people in Europe are unemployed, never mind the misery that workers face in the neo-colonial world, it is inevitable that people will travel to try to better themselves, and that the only solution is to fight for the socialist transformation of society. But this is also an issue that will be a big problem for the next Labour government, who have attacked their own previous policy, have promised to be tough on immigration, and will come to power, if they do, facing a very difficult situation on that. There are other issues, but of course the central thing will be the development of a new stage of mass struggle, which is likely to happen beyond the next general election. It doesn't mean we won't see struggles before the general election. We will undoubtedly see important and potentially very bitter struggles. They're taking place now. The Doncaster care workers strike that's taking place. Also, previously relatively privileged sections of society entering the fray. The fact that the lawyers were out on Friday, 2,000 of them demonstrating, and the comrades reported that the Labour politician who spoke got heckled more than the others. What are you going to do? Are you going to reverse the legal aid changes and so on? So we will certainly see struggles before the general election, particularly if the government wants to go on the offensive. For example, over the question of not being allowed to strike in essential services, we could see generalised strike action before the general election. But that is probably not the most likely scenario, although we have to be prepared for it. And so what we're looking at, in all likelihood, is what will take place after the general election has happened. Now, comrades will say, why is it that we haven't seen the 24-hour general strike? And we say clearly the responsibility for that lies with the trade union leaders, the right-wing trade union leaders who are terrified of it and will do everything they can to stop it, but also a majority of the left leaders who have spoken genuinely in support of general strike action, but have pulled back when it comes to actually being prepared to take the action that is necessary to organise or to fight for coordinated strike action. Really, the only exception to that is what the PCS has done, fighting for coordinated action. And there, of course, we play an important role. It's a sign of our strength in that union that Chris Boff has just been re-elected unopposed because the right one couldn't even get the nominations for the leadership, the Assistant General Secretary's position in PCS. We've got to do a job on the other comrades that are up for election. But the PCS is really an exception. The majority of the other left leaders have not been prepared to face up to what is necessary in order to organise a mass struggle against austerity. And we have to say, political and industrial issues are interlinked. In the wake of Collins, the idea we've got to hold on for Labour, let's not call a 24-hour general strike, let's not take action, that is likely to grow even amongst those union leaders that were previously campaigning in favour of it. Now, I don't want to trespass too much, I've got very little time left, on the points that the comrades from Salford are going to raise in their resolution, which I think will be very good to have the debate on some of those issues. But in the view of the EC, then we think we've taken a correct attitude in how we've taken up the leadership of Unite in particular. It's clear that since the election of Len McCluskey, there has been an improvement in the union, in the sense that workers can get ballots, that it's possible to take strike action, and where workers are determined to fight, then they have been able to do so. But we have nonetheless criticised the fact that workers have sometimes had to fight to get those ballots, and that's certainly been the case in Besner. In Grangemouth, which is dealt with in the Perspectives document, Unite went into that completely unprepared for the kind of battle that they were facing, and as a result, a defeat took place. So we do criticise, not just on the political, but the industrial issues as well. But we think it's correct to put our criticisms in a firm but fraternal way. And that is not a question of offending the leadership of the unions. That doesn't matter to us, although we don't do it unnecessarily. What matters to us is the attitude of the rank and file of the unions. And that's mixed. You can have elements who are sharply critical because of their own experience. But the mass at the moment, particularly in a union like Unite that has seen to have improved, would feel they might not be perfect, but they're our leadership, they're the best we've got, and when that leadership has been under big attack from the capitalist class, would not appreciate a kind of headlong assault on what the leadership has done. Much better to take a careful and nuanced point of view when we raise criticisms, but we do. Not least, not just on Grangemouth, but in general, the leadership of Unite, along with the other major unions, have not seen that it's possible to organise a 24-hour general strike against austerity, which, if it had happened, would probably mean that Grangemouth would not even have taken place, because it would have changed the class balance of forces. Now, why is it that the union leaders have been able to get away without calling generalised strike action? We've made the point repeatedly that they've only ever done it when it has begun to develop from below. And so in that sense, this is linked to the questions of consciousness and the points that were made in the last discussion, that the working class entered this period of economic crisis profoundly unprepared. That was a question of the throwing back of socialist consciousness as a result of the collapse of Stalinism and what had gone in the previous epoch. But it was also a weakening of the working class's consciousness of its own power and of the organisations of the working class in the sense of the trade unions, aside from the lack of a mass political party. And all of that has meant that while workers have been prepared to struggle when a lead is given, they've not understood what is necessary to force the union leaders to act or to push them aside. That is changing on the basis of bitter experience. Look at the FBU. The way the London FBU fought against the National Executive of the Union to demand that the strike action was put on and made to be 24-hour general strike action. Or look at the role that we've been able to play as a catalyst in the NUT to fight for the strike action at the end of March, although I think it's not certain that the union leadership will hold firm on that issue. But we've been able to act as a catalyst for that to take place. So the working class is learning through bitter experience, and a new layer of trade union militants and youth are developing who will be the leaders of future struggles, but are also potential recruits to our party, both now and in the future. Of course, while the obstacle that exists at the moment remains at the top, workers, as we discussed last year, can find a way round it. And we can see all kinds of explosions. We can see workers taking action not currently in the existing trade unions, but saying we've had enough and just walking out. Our general policy has to be to encourage them to join the trade unions and to take part in the existing trade union organisation. But it's been shown by the Three Coasters strike, it's a small straw in the wind. There can be examples, the workers there, the small IWGB, the syndicalists, did actually say to them, we think you should stay in unison and fight. And the workers said, no, we don't want to. We want to just be in the IWGB. So you can see different trends developing, particularly with fresh layers of the working class. And we do have to be prepared to be flexible. For the NSSN or even Youth Fight for Jobs to organise workers in that situation, particularly where struggles erupt. But of course, then our main goal should be to win them to the official and existing trade union movement, as we've got an opportunity to do with the Bakers Union initiative at the moment. There's also the question of the bedroom tax and the other council tax benefit cuts. The fact that in Scotland, the government is talking about abolishing the bedroom tax, and meanwhile in England and Wales, Labour councils are starting to evict people. We can see conflagrations taking place on that issue. There's the question of fracking. There's the question of the NHS, of the latest round of council cuts, all kinds of different issues that can lead to important local struggles. We also have to say there is the prospect of further riots. When the Met Police talk about wanting water cannon, actually they want water cannon against the organised movements of the working class against austerity, not against rioters. Doesn't mean that they wouldn't use rioters this summer if they take place as a reason to get the water cannon that they want for other means. But given the fact there is a whole generation of young people who don't have work, who don't have an education, the fact the EMA has gone, who have a hatred of the police with everything that's happened around the Mark Duggan issue, you could see conflagrations taking place against this again this summer. The capitalists are probably aware of that. In my view, that's one reason that they've gone to have a public inquiry on the question of police infiltration of ourselves, Wari, and around the Stephen Lawrence issue. It's in order to try and head off the issue, to be seen to be doing something. What did Tony Blair say public inquiries were for? Well, this is an attempt to do that on the question of the police because of the anger that exists amongst young people, particularly in the cities. So we have to be prepared for all kinds of developments. But just to conclude, this isn't the easiest period for our party, nor is it the easiest period for the working class. Let's face it, the working class has suffered defeats since we were last here in this conference last year. Living conditions have been driven down further, more cuts have taken place. And so it is, of course, frustrating, but we've also got to understand that on the basis of the bitter lessons that workers are drawing now, they will draw conclusions about what is necessary to win next time. And even now, the most thinking sections of the working class are thinking through those issues. What does that mean? That it's necessary to take action. That to get action, it's necessary for workers to be organised. To be organised not just in general, but in a party. And not just any old party, but a party is serious about fighting to transform society, serious about the struggle for socialism. Those are not the conclusions of the majority of workers at this point in time. But there are a layer who are looking in that direction and can be won to our party now. And on the basis of the events that are coming and a new upsurge of struggle, we can win, as the comrades are having the opportunity to do in the US, hundreds and thousands of people to the ideas of socialism.